So good morning everyone. We will move to the next session. This is by Dr. Rennie Thomas. So we are very happy to have Dr. Rennie Thomas, who is an assistant professor at ISER Bhopal. Dr. Rennie Thomas is currently assistant professor of sociology and social anthropology at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, India. He was the TACI visiting global professor at New York University from 2024 to 2025 and previously taught sociology at the University of Delhi from 2015 to 2021. He has been a Charles Wallace Fellow in Social Anthropology at Queen's University Belfast, Northern Ireland, UK from 2017 to 2018 and a visiting fellow at the Department of Cultural Anthropology and Cultural History at the Friedrich Schiller University, Jena, Germany from 2022 to 2023. His research interests and published works are broadly in the fields of science and technology studies and anthropology of religion. He has done extensive ethnographic fieldwork in Indian scientific laboratories in Bengaluru, formerly Bangalore, Thiruvananthapuram, formerly Trivandrum and Delhi, and currently doing fieldwork at Unani hospitals in Bhopal, exploring how science, medicine, society interacts, negotiates and co-produce modern institutions and disciplines. He is the author of the book Science and Religion in India, Beyond Disenchantment, published by Routledge in 2021 and co-editor of the book Mapping Scientific Method, Disciplinary Narrations, again by Routledge in 2022. His forthcoming works include a co-edited volume that explores the politics of decolonial and the possibilities of decolonizing decolonial itself, titled Decolonial Keywords, South Asian Thoughts and Attitudes, forthcoming from Columbia University Press and Tuliga Books in September 2025. We warmly welcome you on.
I actually, I had the opportunity to listen to Murphy, the last part of the lecture. So what I'm going to do is more, about the methodological questions that I have struggled, but I think it will be also relatable to all of us. So that's why it's titled From Lab to Clinic, because I have done field work in laboratories before and now doing field work in a clinic. So it's kind of metaphorical actually, from lab to clinic, the questions that we face while we are in the field. Now, ethnographic experiences, you're so fortunate to really have Murphy talking about his fieldwork experience, but it's very rare that we see anthropologists actually writing about their fieldwork experiences. You'll find, text, but it's not very often that you find anthropologists and fieldworkers writing about their own experiences of being in the field. Now, Paul Rabino's, this particular book is very significant in thinking about some of the questions on fieldwork and why we should write about our fieldwork. So I personally really like this quote by Paul Rabino from his book, Reflections on Fieldwork in Morocco. It's basically a classic work from 1977 talking about his experiences. So for example, I quote him, I have asked leading anthropologists of his time who espouse this before and after view of fieldwork, why they haven't written on the subjects themselves, since it seems to be such an important one for the field. The response I received was culturally standardized. Yes, I suppose I thought about it when I was young. I kept diaries perhaps someday, but there are really other things which are more important than writing about one's own experiences of fieldwork, because other things essentially means that, in the sense of it's writing about the objects that you study, maybe data in the sense, right? So this is really fascinating because I'll discuss soon that the reason why we don't really talk about our own experiences, it's also coming from the notion that we do some kind of a objective analysis of the culture. So we have to essentially detach from the object that we study, right? So therefore we are studying, therefore our experiences really don't matter. So that's where the idea comes from. Then you have various really fascinating examples from the discipline of anthropology. Like, one such example is this particular anthropologist called Eleanor Smith Bowen. Very fascinating. She was doing fieldwork in Western Africa. But then, she stayed there for many years and she realized that she was not able to write scientific analysis of the culture that she was doing. So what she did, she wrote a novel, and it's called A Return to Laughter, an anthropological novel, right? It's very fascinating. It was actually one of the first initial exercise in thinking about how one can actually translate the field work experiences into a fiction. It was not necessarily a fiction, but then she had to write a fiction because she was emotionally involved in the field, right? So fiction, therefore, did not really restrict her to use a certain kind of scientific language, which anthropology of that particular time did. This is 1954, right? And in India, of course, since we are looking at Indian examples, there are various texts that you would encounter, right? I mean, the three major that I think are the Field Workers and the Field, edited by M.N. Srinivas, A.M. Shah, and E.A. Ramaswamy, and Encounter and Experience, Personal Accounts of Field Work, edited by Androbite T.N. Madan, 1975, and Anthropological Journeys, Reflections on Field Work. These are like, of course, it represents three different time periods. You can see that, right? And these are all basically experiences of leading sociologists and anthropologists of this country, okay? And this is something that I would really encourage you to look at if you're interested in these, understanding the experiences. Now, in relation to this particular course, I think this figure of Renee Fox is really fascinating for various reasons. First of all, she was a student of one of the proponents of scientific sociology. She was a student of Talcott Parsons. But then she was actually one of the first sociologists who employed ethnographic method, okay? So she has done field work among patients in the ward, and this book, 1959, Experiment Perilous, Physicians and Patients Facing the Unknown, is a fascinating ethnography of the ward, okay, the patients, physicians interaction, really fascinating. And also it's a, as you can see that 1959, where sociologists were not necessarily doing any form of ethnography in the American sense, but she actually pioneered really the ethnographic method. So the reason I talk about this is to really say that how the discipline that we do and the ethnography that we do is very much actually, of course, it has scientificity, but at the same time it is very emotional and experiential. So how do we really understand that experience when we do ethnography, right? I mean, that's what, I thought you might want to think about some of those questions. Now, coming to my experience rather of studying these scientific laboratories, and I studied the scientists actually. I was part of a laboratory for a year trying to understand how these people really live their religious life but also their scientific life. But we face a lot of problems actually I'm glad that we are actually sitting in a scientific and technological institution. So it's not very easy to get access for outsiders to come into these institutions, especially if you happen to be a social scientist or humanities scholar and trying to understand the culture of science actually, right? So there are students who come from scientific and technology institutions understand there are different kinds of hierarchies that exist. Now, this is a very important question that Bruno Latour, in his earlier, the French sociologist and founders actually of the discipline called Science and Technology Studies, a very well-known anthropologist whom we lost actually just 2 years ago, wrote in his initial writing actually in a fascinating essay called Insider and Outsider, sociology of science actually. It's an essay, very interesting essay. So he wrote, since the time of Levi-Bruhl, anthropology has always been interested in sciences actually. You will find actually the classical anthropological texts, they are all writing about the sciences, but they were only interested in the sciences of the others, right? So how come that for them, the cassowary is not classified as a bird? This was a legitimate question. How come that modern taxonomists do classify the cassowary as a bird was not in the purview of anthropologists. Either they took it for granted or they left this question to historians of science, okay? So the anthropologists of that time were not necessarily interested in the modern taxonomies because modern taxonomy was not the subject matter of anthropology at that moment, right? And they were interested in the sciences of the others, ethno, medicine, etc., right? But here you see that he is challenging that kind of an understanding to say that anthropology should come out of that and we have to do more ethnographies of what he calls as the moderns, the ethnographies of the moderns, be it engineers, be it doctors, etc., right? So only then we can actually do what he calls as an anthropology of the moderns, okay? That's something that he developed later. But this question of insider and outsider, that you can classify scientists and non-scientists, it's a crucial question that when you try to really study actually scientists or any practitioners for that matter, okay? And this is where I come from, where I did my field work, mostly in Bangalore, but also occasionally Delhi and Trivandrum. But so just to talk about my experience and then how, since you're all trying to do some kind of ethnography of hospitals and clinics, and it will be useful. So that I was a laboratory member, that identity came to me much later. Initially, you're nothing when you go to the field, right? So it's only after, in my case, I think 5 to 6 months, and they started really identifying me as actually a fellow laboratory member. And that identity really helped me in really engaging with scientists from different departments actually. In Bangalore, one of the leading scientific institutions that I have studied, okay? And using that identity as a laboratory member, I was able to do interviews with scientists from different laboratories, departments, and also other institutions, because Bangalore actually has various scientific institutions, and it's many ways, it's a mecca of sciences, right? You find all kinds of modern scientific institutions in Bangalore, including a scientific research to study Ayurveda, integrative medicine. It's a very fascinating place actually, right? Now, of course, I was part of the laboratory for a year, but while I was in the field, actually in the laboratory, I was also able to read, autobiographies and memoirs of the scientists who are part of the institute. So some of them I have interviewed. So the crucial question that comes to us is, we have access to the data, in the form of memoirs and autobiographies, but then you also interview them. They say something else there. So how do you make sense of, the autobiographical data that we have and the ethnographic data? This is something that all of us face, right? I mean, when you're looking at, for example, the history of Ayurveda, Unani for that matter, that you find a lot of memoirs of these practitioners. But then at the same time, when you talk to them, you get a completely different things. How do you make sense of, these things? So this is something that we all of us face, and that's where I think the notion of archives is very, very significant, that of course, we could always consider the autobiographies of the practitioners as a very significant, archival sources, right? That really then, let us actually interview people and get their information idea, and then try to see some kind of a connection of the narratives, two different forms of narratives. Now, before entering the lab, just like Mofi was talking about Ayurveda Shala, so you have to first of all really convince the people. It's very difficult. I mean, those who are in the field know that it's difficult to get people convinced of what you do, right? And they were always suspicious of you as an outsider, especially if you're not a scientist. Actually, I'm not a scientist, right? So especially they are very suspicious of what they call a social scientist, that I'll discuss later. That so before entering the lab, one has to really convince the field and see that what we are going to do has some significance also for them, right? And this idea that whether the field has any significance, or very often what we do is like, okay, we study because we like. What about the field? Okay, this question of reciprocity is not addressed very often, but in a scientific institution, it's very important to really talk about this reciprocity for a simple reason, because they have access to whatever we write, right? Because the scientists, right? I mean, they know what we're doing and they know our intentions, etc. So it's important that we convince these people, and for that reason, actually, the surveys doesn't really work as a method. Because if you go and talk to them, okay, certain particular question, they're not going to really speak, because the scientists and history of science reveals us that they're not going to really talk about certain questions, right, which can be political, like, so they're very suspicious, and therefore it's important that you be part of the place that they live, right? And that's why ethnography is, I argue, is the only way to really understand these kinds of spaces, including scientific laboratories and other such spaces, because it takes time for them to talk to you, sometimes 3 months, 4 months, to just have the initial conversation actually, right? Of course, that's possible both through formal and informal conversations, and very often through, well, coffee, sometimes conversations, like go out with them in a, coffee and other places. In my case, actually, of course, the institute that I studied has had a culture of drinking coffee every day. So scientists are mostly seen in, coffee shops. So that's a place where you could actually sit and have a conversation with them. And of course, you know, the diary writing, etc., which you know I'm not going to talk about it. But one of the things that I found, and I think most of the field workers, is that we have a very different understanding of field work, and we read ethnographic texts and then we go to the field and then realize that that's not really helping, right? So while we are in the field, we actually invent methods, okay? And you know, we don't, of course, sometimes we go with an idea of method, but it doesn't really work, okay? And I'll show you what and how I have done that. First of all, you know, staying with the scientists is very important, I just mentioned. And I was attending, you know, like the scientific conferences and volunteering actually some of the scientific conferences. This is a very fascinating way to do ethnography because it's, of course, it's difficult to understand sometimes the technicalities, but it is important to be part of those scientific conferences to see how they conduct themselves, right? And you can volunteer as an volunteer, and I was volunteer for multiple scientific conferences in Bangalore, which really helped me, and I'm sure those who are studying, for example, Ayurveda can do the same thing. Various Ayurvedic conferences, you can be volunteer and see how, you know, it works in the structurally and also the intellectual kind of conversation. And in my case, because I was also trying to look at the larger culture of science in India, I was part of also the messes in the campuses. So I was part of one of the messes to understand the dietary practices of scientists actually, okay? So one could also be part of various reading groups and etc., reading group, discussion groups, etc. And then very often we use laboratory ethnography as a way to look at spaces beyond the laboratory. Okay, the laboratory ethnography lab is the space which is very significant, but using that identity, one could do various things, right? You know, so in my case, it really helped me as a lab member to connect with other sections within the campus, okay? Now, when you're in the field, one of the things that you see is that you will have to attend various lab talks. And I know that in IITs too, you see that people present their work in front of the PIs actually, right? It's very important because as a sociologist, you find very often that you don't understand what they're saying, but it's really fascinating that once I was asked to give a talk, because since I was part of the lab, they said maybe next week you should give a talk. So when I gave a talk, and actually the lab members, including the PI, told me that, oh, it's too technical to us. And this is very significant if you go back to, again, the larger debate scholars like Latu has developed, is that the notion that what scientists do are seen as technical, and it's beyond social, and it's not graspable to us. And for me as a sociologist, I found it very fascinating when someone tells you, oh, what you do is really technical. And therefore, it's really fascinating to actually understand the very notion of technical itself, right? You know, very often we see that these disciplines as soft disciplines, you know, sociology, history, these are soft, but scientists don't really perceive in that way, especially when you present the work. They think that it is really technical to them. So what really is technical is something that I thought at that moment, because one has to really contextualize what is technical, right? And I think the technical, of course, many anthropologists and STS scholars have really looked at, one person being Stephen Shapin. He looked at actually the notion of what we call as soft science and hard science in the context of United States. And he says very clearly that it's only after, you know, the Cold War, 1960, that you see that many of the disciplines that we see today as hard became hard, such as economics, right? Or even psychology for that matter. Many universities actually offer MSc in psychology instead of MA in psychology, MSc in economics instead of MA in economics, right? These are all part of what he calls as, you know, the scientification of these disciplines. And it came through basically mathematization, right? You know, you have to do statistics and mathematics, therefore it is essentially the real science. Okay, and that really happened with certain important social science disciplines like psychology, economics. I think to some extent sociology also in the US, right? Very technical in that sense, right? And of course, you know, so that's where the idea that, you know, when you're in the field, actually you realize that there is a distinction between what you do as a practitioner, be it a sociologist or a psychologist, versus the scientist. So what scientists do might look very technical to us, but what we do also look very technical to them. So then we have to really problematize this notion of what really is technical, okay? That comes from the field work from the lab. But even though you're in the field for 1 year, 2 years, is it easy to get acceptance in the field? And the answer is no. because this is of course from Latour and Woolger, The Laboratory Life, a classic book actually in STS. So they write, when an outside observer first expresses interest in the activities of working scientists, he can expect one of a variety of different reactions. If he is a fellow professional scientist working in a different field, say for example a physicist working in something related to physics but from a chemistry department, he will or she will be still allowed. So if he is a student working towards final submission into the scientific profession, the outsider will usually find that his interest is easily accommodated. Barring any circumstances involving extreme secrecy, like if you're studying some space science or something, or competition between the parties, scientists can react to expressions of interest by adopting a teaching role. You can be a teaching assistant in a scientific lab, no? Outsiders can thus be told the basic principles of scientific work in a field which is relatively strange to them, physicists to a biology, for example, right? However, for outsiders who are completely ignorant of science and do not aspire to join the ranks of scientists, such as an anthropologist or a historian of science, the situation is rather different. Or a psychologist who wants to understand, the everyday life of scientists, the most naive and perhaps least common reaction is that the non-scientific outsiders simply have no business probing the activities of science. This is something that you find. You are in IIT, you can go to any of the scientific department, they might not allow you to enter their lab, right? For this particular reason, okay? And that's why we need to really strategize our existence in the laboratory. So I'll just talk about what I have done. Now, while I was in the field, 3 months, they gave me a space to sit like this, and then, people won't talk to me. And the PI, when I joined the laboratory, so introduced me to the larger lab. We had around 35 people in the laboratory. So he introduced me to the lab, the larger collective, saying that, okay, this is Rennie Thomas, and he is our new lab member, but he is not a scientist. Okay, and that made actually all the lab members nervous that what is this person going to do. So first 3 months, no conversation, nothing, okay. So, but I didn't know the reason why they were not talking to me, okay. That I came to know only while I was finishing my field work. They thought I was a spy, that the PI has appointed me to make sure that they're working, okay. So what I did, because I wanted to basically talk to these people, so I while having initial conversation, I thought that I need to convince them, right. So I thought, maybe, a philosopher of science who actually had a degree in physics, okay. He was visiting Bangalore and he happened to be a friend of mine. So I said, why don't you give a talk to my, group, and he gave a talk actually and really convinced people because he has a PhD in physics from a leading American university, but he became a philosopher of science later. So then it became easy and they said, okay, if someone like this person can do the kind of work that you do, that means it has value. There is still a sense of scientificity because of his science background that they took me seriously, right? But that's one of the few ways that we could actually, start having conversation. Then another historian of science who she also had a first PhD in biotechnology from IIT Delhi. So again, that helped, right? So this is what I was saying, that while we are in the field, we actually invent new methods. So for me, actually having talks by a philosopher and a historian of science who actually had training in sciences really helped in opening up spaces for me, right? So after that, the lab members started coming to me for, suggestions on what they should read. They would ask me, hey, what do you think about Karl Popper? I was shocked. They were aware of Karl Popper, but they wanted me to tell basically what kind of text that they should read. So that is only because of these two people, right? So that's what I was saying, that why we need to really invent methods while in the field, right? And of course, for that reason, it's very difficult to get access to these kind of sacred spaces. Basically, laboratories are sacred spaces, right? And you have to really struggle a lot to get access. And that's one of the reasons why we don't really have enough laboratory ethnographies in India, but this is clearly not the case just in India, everywhere actually, right? So one work, of course, the reason is it's not easy to get entry, but it's a matter of luck. And it's also a generosity of scientists and conversation. Some of the scientists who allowed me to be part of his lab had some interest in history of science, because while he was a PhD student in chemistry in a leading university, he was into cricket, and one of his friends happened to be a historian. So that's how he thought that, okay, there is value of this kind of work, and that he allowed me to be part of his lab for a year, right? And in India, actually, Pankaj Seksaria's work is very interesting because he has done fieldwork in a Pune laboratory. It's one of the rare few works that you have. And my work, of course, the result of my staying in the field resulted in this book. And the book discusses, among other things, the life of Ayurveda in post-colonial India. In chapter 1, discusses debates on scientific method. That led me to actually my, the kind of work that I'm doing about how do we make sense of the question on scientific method when we study a practice such as Unani. Okay, this is not really important, but okay. I happen to tell you frankly, as I said in the beginning, the ethnography is also experiential, right? I started really studying clinics in Bhopal only because I happened to be in Bhopal. I spent all my life in Delhi, and I found myself in Bhopal teaching, and I realized what should I do because, so I thought because the old part of Bhopal is really fascinating, and I found this homeopathic clinic very, very interesting. So initially I started having conversation with the doctors in a homeopathic clinic, and this person is very interesting. But what was fascinating is that homeopathy as a medicine, it came from Germany, right? It's really not Indian in that sense, but it came from Germany and became Indian. Okay, and I was having a conversation with this particular doctor, and she told me Bhopal being it's a very fascinating place because of this Nawabi history and everything, that a lot of the homeopathy practitioners actually do Unani in their own ways, right? So homeopathy medicine, they have a degree she's a doctor actually, right? They have a DHMS, Doctor of Homeopathy Medicine and Surgery, but they also take help from the Unani practitioners. And that's when I thought maybe Unani practitioners, because it's for various reasons they are very fascinating, I thought I wanted to study Unani doctors. So I started doing field work in a government Unani clinic in Bhopal. Really fascinating, this is of course a lot of the people who come there are, working class population of particular religious group, etc. So I started doing field work in this particular place, and I was interested in certain questions that I wanted to understand the everyday life of Unani in the contemporary India. How do they make sense of their own identity as people who go to a particular clinic, okay? So what is the connection between clinic and society, okay? And in that sense, how, this is also the case when we study Ayurveda, that can we really look at, these forms of medicine beyond medicine? Like how do we study, for example, Unani or Ayurveda to make sense of identities, be it religious identities, be it caste and those kind of questions, right? And in this case of Unani, you see that there is a clear connection with religion, right? Because it's mostly practiced with Muslims. So how do we make sense? How do they make sense of their identity while practicing, the Unani in the contemporary times, right? But I was not really interested in looking at the traditional practitioners, what they are called the Hakims, right? But I was interested in what we call the doctors. Okay, the Hakims versus the doctors. So the doctors are people who actually have degrees in Unani, BUMS, Bachelor of Unani Medicine and Surgery. Some of them also have masters, etc. Right? These are the people who work in the hospitals, right? So I started studying them, making sense of what they do, and in relation to the state, but also the patients. How do they talk to them? Do they form a sense of community by interacting, etc. Okay. So in that process, I also started looking at the question of scientific method, right? So I was having a conversation with actually just before Biju. So the Unani practitioners think that they are more scientific among others. Okay, and this notion of scientificity is also very significant because it is to be relevant and significant. To say that we are real doctors, that's also coming from the fact that we need more people, patients coming to us. Okay, but also there is a social life of this idea of scientific method. Right? So it is also sometimes important to say that what we say is everything is scientific, and the scientific actually does something else beyond science actually, right? Because it also, the usage of scientific is very political in the sense that it is to convince that what we do has relevance and importance, etc. Okay? So therefore, ethnography of Unani, essentially, I argue, is essentially an ethnography of a community. Similarly, you do ethnography of Ayurveda is essentially ethnography of a community. Okay? In that sense, I am using the notion of laboratory as an extension of society, as Bruno Latour has argued. Can we really study society through the laboratories? The laboratories are essentially micro-societies that he argues in his work. I am also interested in looking at Unani and its interaction with other systems such as Ayurveda, right? And I'll show you some photos later. But essentially, the reason of looking at Unani is to also look at the notion of identities. And in the case of Unani, the historian of medicine, C.M. Alavi, argued that Unani is essentially Indo-Islamic medicine. It is not, an outsider medicine. It is very much Indian, right? And so in that sense, using these kind of archival sources, and I am of course doing ethnography, to really communicate this idea that medicine can be a way to look at actually forms of identities and belongings and everything. Do they belong or not can be then understood through medical practices. Okay, some photos from the field. You're welcome to Bhopal anytime and see these clinics. This is actually one of the interesting places because one of the few government Unani medical hospitals in central India. Okay. And what is interesting is also the translation of these categories, like Department of, and you can see that like the English, they translate medical jurisprudence, might not be exact translation, but these English translations are very important. Like preventive and community medicine is a very, allopathic category, but then you use in a Unani tradition, like I'm sure in Ayurveda also they do it. Now, this is something, the point that I last made, how do actually Unani interact with other medical practices. This very interesting text that I found from Government Ayurveda College in Trivandrum recently. This is essentially about, basically it really talks about how one could really think about different medicines together. So this is essentially about Siddha, Ayurveda, Unani for various solutions. It has like solutions for everything, whatever we face in everyday life. So again, the idea is that actually how Unani can be used for everyday purposes, like, like what happens if you have a fever. Right? So in this particular book has solutions for everything, but from all the medicines, Unani, Siddha, Ayurveda, which I thought was very fascinating. I haven't read the text yet actually because I just found the text recently. Okay, so I just want to have some end by saying that actually this volume that is forthcoming has some discussion about how do we understand some medical practices too. Some chapters actually has debate about is there a way of looking at, for example, Unani. If you are looking at Unani, is it a way to really look at actually decolonizing medicine? Because very often when we think of decolonizing medicine, we think about decolonizing through certain other medical practices. What about bringing in questions around Unani and that as a way of decolonizing medicine, especially in the South Asian context, raises certain important, interesting questions, right? Okay, so I would end by really suggesting some books, some texts that I think is really interesting on the idea of ethnography. First of all, I'm currently reading Kiran Narayan's new book, so that's why I highlighted it because I haven't read it. But it's really fascinating. Anything of Kiran Narayan is just fascinating because the idea of writing comes so beautifully in her writings, right? All the books. So I would suggest the first book, The Life and the Writing, Crafting Ethnography in the Company of Chicago. And the other book, of course, Anand Pandyan's book, Possible Anthropology, and Laboratory Life for those who are interested in the laboratory ethnography. But then if you want to understand actually clinics too, right? Any form of clinical, any form of clinics can be studied using the methods that Latour has proposed in his work. And Stephen Helmreich again is a very interesting anthropologist. He studies scientists of a different kind. He studies oceanographers. The human-sea relations. What happens when scientists are actually not with humans, but with the fish, and they have different kind of insights. It's very fascinating. And Leslie Sharp's work is about what happens to scientists when they develop certain kind of emotions with the animals that they study, including the rats in the biological laboratories, right? It's really fascinating how she talks about emotions in the scientific laboratory. Sometimes they name, the objects, the rats and other places, and they die and they celebrate their death actually. So what happens to the very practice of science when emotion really comes in laboratory, right? So that's what the Leslie Sharp's book and Andrew McDowell's fascinating book on tuberculosis, fieldwork based in Rajasthan. So these are some of the texts that I thought you might want to look at. I don't know if it is really connected to the course, but thank you. And this is, of course, from the Ayurveda College, and you can see that, the texts from Sanskrit, Malayalam, Tamil, everything is there. And I think Government Ayurveda College at Trivandrum has really fascinating material for historians and anthropologists who want to study Ayurveda, but the bureaucracy can be a bit difficult. Thank you. Yes.
So if I may, like you talked about when you first went into the lab and then for the first 3 months maybe they did not interact with you because they thought that you were spy. So I just want to know like what experiences or like how did you navigate this particular challenge for your further ethnographic study?
Yeah, so that was through informal conversation, like we used to go for chai, coffee, and started talking about different questions about personal life and everything. And then the thing about laboratories that they have various sessions because lab is about pressure, people have pressure. The PI basically he conducts a tour every year. 2 tours every year, excursions. So I was part of those and then became very informal conversations. And it's only through that informal conversation that they were able to talk to me, the formal thing. So there is a thin line really between the formal and the informal. But it's mostly about spending time with them, having chai, listening to their worries. I think that's the only way. That's how I got access. But again, it differs from place to place, like scientific laboratories are different, and if you're studying a clinic, it might be different. But I think the idea is to really listen to the informalities, be it about their life and personal and everything. That really helps. And they should also know that you're serious and it's not just for certain kind of monetary benefit, but the fact that you have an interest in their life, it matters to them most of the times. Yeah.
They may not be aware what is that, but they would just go with the flow because they're used to that kind of words. Then how did you note it down when we're actually in an informal conversation and you have to go back and sometimes you don't even remember the terms. So how did you write them and how did that?
So that's very important. Actually, what I did was when I get those kind of words, I try to remember mostly, but the moment I'm back in the lab, I write down. Okay, and if I have any question, I ask that person after some time. But at the same time, I was also trying to learn their techniques. So I was trying to assist them. When they go do the technical work, I basically am part of the laboratory. I try to learn, and they give me some textbook, basic text of spectroscopy, and so I had some idea what they were doing. But of course, it's too complex. But then it's important that you try to learn the basics of what they are doing. Depends on the laboratory that you are in. But also, they're very happy to talk about what they do always, right? So they need someone to listen. So you can always ask them, what were you talking before? They would be happy to do that. But I guess most importantly, if you're doing, for example, a laboratory work, it's good to be a volunteer and do some kind of a technical work. I'll give you an example of how I started. It's a scientific laboratory and they have to write papers. It's a chemistry lab. So basically, as you know, that the chemists as a scientific community, they write a lot of papers. So the PI told me essentially that, well, you can be part of the laboratory, but you have to edit our papers. So I had that role to edit their English. So in that way, I also encountered a certain word. Then they could ask me, hey, what exactly is this technique? So it really helps in that sense, so that you're part of the laboratory, but yet you're not part of the laboratory, right? In that sense.
So on a related note,
Yeah.
So when you went to the lab, there was that maybe at least during the initial phases,
Yeah.
the outsider thing, since you are not a scientist, you won't understand this. Did you experience any such kind of othering? Use the word in the Ayurvedic clinics?
Ayurveda clinic, I have not done field work. Unani clinics, no. Because in the Unani clinic, I was mostly talking to patients. It's a very different group, right? You're talking about the scientists as experts. They think they know everything, which is different from the patient. Then,
in Ayurveda, the Unani was the practitioners.
the doctors I did, but they're practicing doctors. And I didn't have this kind of conversation like the one I had with the scientists, because I was part of the lab. But here in Unani, I'm still trying to get access to the lab, because for various reasons, I am not part of the clinic yet. yeah, I mean, maybe they are not convinced yet of my presence. So I go to the hospital to talk to them, not the medical college where I really want to be part of. Yeah.
So you
I-
said,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. She raised her hand and.
you were speaking about insider and outsider perspective. So could you please elaborate how did you position yourself as a social scientist into a scientific place? How did you position yourself?
Yeah.
Whether your subjective and I don't know whether the presence of subjective and objective experience or knowledge is there. I'm not aware about it, but I'm asking: is there any kind of how did you handle it?
Yeah. First of all, the lab, they never heard about ethnography before. They had no idea. They knew that people do journalism and stuff. So I remember while talking to the lab members over a cup of coffee, and they said, yeah, but what you do is so simple, It's like you talk to people and you write. That's not like us. So they think that what we do is very simple, and, it's not like rigorous work and everything. And they very often compare you with journalists, like that. But things changed only after the talks. They realized that, and then after I gave my, the lab talk first, then they realized, okay, this is really not the case. And I remember one of the lab members who told me that what you do may be something connected to journalism, that it is too complex to understand. And he said, like, maybe why don't you people actually write in a language that we understand? So you see how they negotiate actually. The idea, of course, my presence as a sociologist was an outsider there. But I became an insider. It's not an insider, some kind of a near insider I call. Like only because I was listening to them, etc., right? But not really an epistemological insider because I am not a scientist and they knew that I'm not. So they, for example, had it's a major conference that happened in that institute. So I was in all India with other scientists, right? So they gave me the role where technically is not involved, like giving water, like that kind of thing, right? So they know that I'm not a insider. But that's how, it's difficult to be part of an insider. But then the idea of insider and outsider is for us to problematize as scholars. They would never consider you as an insider, but it's for us to really see the very problematic of this distinction of what they call as insider and outsider. That's what he says, Latour, like in that sense, yeah.
So you said researching about medicines also understanding different forms of identities and belonging. That's one of my central research questions.
Okay.
So I also was undergoing all the kind of like doing other works in Ayurvedic clinic and stuff like that. So I wanted to ask you what were the particular notes that you touched upon. For example, you mentioned about text. And when it comes to the stakeholders, did you talk to the patients as well as physicians? Or what was that? Can you throw a little bit of intricacies on as to exactly what all did you do?
So first of all, being in the clinic, it's busy time, right? Mostly Saturdays and Sundays, and what happens is the patients really don't want to talk to you because they're there for something. So I was thinking about I have a section which I, in the process of developing, is this notion of waiting. And this happens to everyone, who goes to a clinic, that we wait. The patients wait to see the doctor. But there is also different intricacies. The patients wait to get cure, but sometimes some patients, the notion of death comes, etc., right? But similarly, ethnographers always wait to talk to the patients and to the doctors, right? In my case, I was waiting there. I was thinking about the notion of waiting in the clinic, actually, right? So, of course, the patients and the doctors while they practice, while they talk, right? And that's what is important because the sessions are very important because that's when you know that, again, to be part of that conversation is not an easy exercise, right? That's where you have to have that convincing that if the doctors think that you can be part of it, only then, because otherwise you're a complete outsider and they're scared of an outsider. In my case, what happens is, because even though I'm not a scientist, but I work in a science institute, so when I go there, they think that maybe that I'm very suspicious of their method. because I'm from a scientific institute. So again, I have to tell them that no, I'm not a scientist, I'm doing something else, history of science and everything. They're not really familiar with these categories, right? So talking to doctors, talking to, of course, patients, but I think most importantly, I found talking to the technicians very useful. And you'll find that also in Ayurveda clinic. They are the people who are making things. And very often we don't consider these people as, people who make medicine, but they're very important, the technicians and the peons and everyone. The pharmacist, the receptionist is again an important category, right? So these people actually, the receptionist sometimes they might not be, depends on the, the day, right? Because sometimes it can be really, really busy day. They are not really in a mood to talk. But then what happens is after 5 o'clock, then it's easy, right? Once things are okay, you can maybe have a conversation with them. And also I don't know whether you have tried this, it's very fascinating. I found it very fascinating, is that the shop owners near the clinics, like the people who sell chai and other thing, it's very useful to really talk to them because they know really the everyday workings of these places. And they also even identify the patients. Some of them are regular, they know that, So these, what we could call actually as, for example, when you are really studying a scientific laboratory, so we need to really go beyond the sites of science, right? It's not that, like Emily Martin, for example, when she was looking at the AIDS epidemic, she argued that actually, even though when she was doing laboratory ethnography, she argued that we need to go beyond laboratory because when we look at AIDS, it's not that we have to only study the place where you make the medicine, but we also have to study the NGOs, right? We also have to study the patients. It's a multi-sited ethnography in that sense, no? So therefore, when we study clinics, it's important that we also talk to people who are not necessarily part of the clinic in the traditional sense, yet they can have a stake, such as the shop owners, people who, deliver medicines, like the pharmacists that you mentioned. These are stakeholders that are very useful, actually. In my experience, I would like to know from your, whether in the Ayurveda clinic, how that was the case.
I have one more question myself. Did you also refer to the text? And was there any kind of rituals or like some practices that was peculiar that you observed in their routine? Like for example, in Ayurveda, before doing the Panchakama procedure, there is a prayer.
Yeah.
And I was working in the Catholic nuns hospital. So before they start the day, there is an extensive prayer, medical prayer, and all.
Okay.
Was there anything of that sort that you noticed?
Yeah. So what happens is these are secular hospitals, government. So the prayer happens with the hakims, right? But not in the government hospitals, because these are supposed to be secular, right? So because it is also about the idea of modernizing. Right, it's a very secular place. Any patients can come, etc. Right, but if you actually listen to, or if you have a conversation with hakims, then you'll find various references to religion as well. Not here, and it is also a way to really, I think, survive and exist to show that how modern Unani is, like allopathy, right? So that's where the idea of the notion of secular becomes very significant in these government institutions. Whether that's the case in all the places is different. There are maybe the Unani doctors how to really show their identity, secular, etc. Right? So that's also very different. So that's also the place where the notion of identities, the notion of the fact that you belong, etc., becomes very significant in these places. Yeah. Yes.
So, sir, you talked about how you did ethnography in Unani settings. So, my question was, since I'm from psychology background, so when we intern at psychiatry wards, we are supposed to portray ourselves as someone who is an intern doctor, even when they introduce us when we are interning there. So, it is something we have to wear the white coat.
Yeah.
So, my question is, did you have to change anything in your appearance to get that insider perspective so that patients accept you more? And another question is, did you face any ethical challenges while doing your ethnography which might have affected, methodologically might have affected your study as like ethical challenges that might have affected ethnography as a methodology?
So the first question, of course, not, because unlike the psychologists, like one is not a clinical, like I'm not a clinical person. So first of all, they wouldn't allow you to do that, right? I have to just sit and observe and listen, because they would it's also about whether they are okay with the fact that you're wearing that kind of dress, so, but in your case, being a psychologist, it is possible because of the clinical identity that you have. That's not the case for an anthropologist or a historian, The second question, in the sense that, the college that I want to be part of, essentially, the medical college where they teach, so it's predominantly women students actually, So one of the reasons why I don't get access, because I'm an outsider in many ways, right? On my gender. So that question is there. So it's difficult to basically get access to a place in certain situations, like, so that's one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily part of the classrooms. I wanted to be part of the classroom because that's where teaching happens. But so far I didn't get access to that, because I think it's a question of gender. So one of the suggestions, I think when I gave a talk at the graduate center, that one anthropologist, she told me that maybe, it's good to go with a women, student or a researcher. That might help, but I don't know. But this is what the speculation is. So that's an ethical question that I am finding currently, especially since I want to be part of the classroom. Other than that, nothing, because this is my new work. I have not really spent a lot of time in the clinic. It's only after I spend some time that I know these questions. But yeah.
You were saying don't go with the idea of method. Like, what is it?
So that doesn't mean that anything goes. What I meant is, like, because before we go to there is a certain sense of preparation that we all have, right? Like we do a coursework, and where you have courses in research methods, and where we are taught, and we all have to read certain kind of ethnographic texts, maybe in the Indian context, all of us have to remember the age, and like M.N. Srinivas and all, and various other texts also. But when you are in the field, you realize, okay, but that's not really helping. Because the anthropological text that we have read, it was done in a particular context, right? And in my context, of course it helps, but in my context, for example, I had to really think about these questions in a different manner. Because what is the notion of organizing certain kind of conversations from experts in the laboratory? That's possible only because I was studying scientific laboratories where it was about experts. It might not work if you're doing somewhere else, Like, I have students who are working on different questions. I have a student who is working on space scientists. It's so difficult to get access to these places. But he was able to get access, and one of the reasons is because he is from ISER. This connection of science and etc., right? But if he was from some other universities, I don't think it is possible, right? So every field therefore requires new ways of approaching people and understanding the situation. That's what I said, that we have to invent new method. Not in the sense that we shouldn't read. We have to read proper ethnographic works and everything before you go to the field. That really helps. But then that also helps you in reinventing what you have read, in that sense.
Sir,
Oh, yeah.
sir, like you were saying, this art subject also, we need to do some science knowledge. So, like my question is, how much it's important to teach the arts subjects like history and all, give the science knowledge.
Okay.
And second thing is, like, what is the need for an art subject to go in behind this science recognition? And then second thing is, like, when it's come to any patients, those who are affected with mental illness or something like that, at the end of the day, we cannot measure their pains with the measurements, right?
Yeah.
Like how much they are paying, that cannot be measured with the quantitative things. We need some qualitative things. Like, where you are positioning yourself, like whether you like to see yourself as a scientist or like being the originality of, let it be the Unani or Ayurvedic, its own uniqueness, why we need to incorporate this scientific term.
Okay, that's a larger question. But yes, no, I'm not a scientist. And then the discipline that I represent, science and technology studies, very much against the notion of calling any social scientist, right? Because why should we have that identity of being a scientist? That's completely not, right? And that's why we have disciplines as anthropology of science, understanding what they do, right? And now the notion of hardness and softness that came, as I have discussed, this is a fascinating essay which I can share with Murphy, then you will get it. It's a fascinating essay by Stephen Shapin. Actually, it's called Hard Science, Soft Science, Political History of Disciplines or something. It's really fascinating because he even talks about some disciplines that we think in this particular situation as hard, they were not hard disciplines. Like, for example, he talks about biology as a discipline. Now, biology is, of course, is a hard discipline now, right? And he says it became a hard science only systems medicine came, like, the mathematization really happened in biological sciences. Therefore, it became more prestigious and rigorous, right? And what he is saying that how even the so-called hard sciences, how to follow the mathematical modeling to be called as hard. And similarly, the economics and psychology and other disciplines, right? So that's precisely the question that I see when you're listening to, the stories of pain and illness, you realize that actually these kind of hardness doesn't really work. That's why I think, that you're doing courses like this, ethnography, to listen to people. And most of the times, that's not really the case with the hard disciplines, like, But there is a larger politics why you need that identity of hard science. And that really has to do with, as Stephen Shapin argues, is to do with state funding or funding from any institutions, right? So the Science Foundation, etc., would fund you if your work is scientific. And you can see, if you look at statistics of maybe, I don't know, the National Science Foundation or anywhere, where most of the funding went to hard sciences. Right? And that's why disciplines like economics actually struggled and they wanted to be a hard discipline so that they get funding. It's essentially about getting money. Right? I mean, that's the economics of this.
Sir, can you repeat the name of the researcher?
Stephen Shapin. Stephen Shapin. S-H-A-P-I-N. Shapin. He's a professor of history of science at Howard University.
Sir, I have another question.
I think, you had a question, then I'll come to you.
Yes, please, sir, you can.
Sir, I am amazed to speak in very almost because I have only some appreciative comments and resonating what you have said, how contexts are more important than the content.
Yeah.
Then what Dr. Satya said, why should arts be considered lower than science?
Yeah.
Why MA should not be above MSc?
Yeah.
That is also good. That reminds me of the article by Engel, The Need for a New Biomedical Model, wherein he says, I attended a conference and I found psychiatrists were as if urging the physicians and the internists, oh, take us within you, take us within your group. It's not necessary, he said. You are different and more powerful.
Yeah.
So this hierarchy actually
Yeah.
does damage at
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
And us and them and outsider, insider, in the research paper I read, they use the word in-betweener.
In-betweener.
And that was used by a chronic psychotic patient when he addressed the researcher who earlier worked in the same ward as a psychiatrist. And in that ward, he went to work as a ethnography student, and he was doing a field work there. So he said, you are an in-betweener. He said, in-betweener? Yes. You don't belong to research, the doctors, and you don't belong to patients.
Yeah.
And they don't like you.
Yeah.
He said, who doesn't like you? Doctors don't like you. Because you have some special privileges.
Yeah.
So patients are astute observers.
Yeah.
And we often fall short in judging them or understanding what they are saying.
Yeah.
So it was amazing. And I remember the neurologist who used to ridicule us. He said, psychiatry, what are your research questionnaires?
Yeah.
They are like standing on the bus stop, asking people to prefer Colgate toothpaste or this is not research. So, or even when I was working with the thesis, and some statisticians would say, you have created this scale, the questionnaire, 1, 2, 3, 4, but they are not equidistant. Mild, moderate, severe, profound. They are not equidistant. How can you prove me that there is the same distance between mild, moderate, So I believe unless the science methods evolve to understand what we are doing, we are going to have to face this kind of stigma.
I think that's really fascinating, because if you then look at the hierarchies between psychiatrists and psychologists, and different kinds of hierarchies, like whether...
Sorry, it is not there. I come from a teacher who told me that psychology is more difficult than psychiatry. Psychiatrists just check the symptoms and give medicines. Psychologists deal with normal people. And they need not have to be presented when they are doing internship. They don't have to be presented as doctors. Psychologists.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Thank you. Okay, sorry.
Just one question regarding the ethical consideration itself. You also talked about how the shopkeepers outside the lab or the institute become so important, and then to have some informal discussions or conversations with them. But then when we go for ethnographic studies also, the informed consent plays a very important role. So in your case, how did you navigate this particular thing?
It happens over a period of time, like first few weeks, in fact, in the shop owners, they wouldn't even know what you're doing, right? They're just talking, they'll talk to anyone actually, right? But then of course you'll have to tell them, okay, I'm doing this particular research, and so you have to inform. It's extremely important. But it doesn't work like if you're asking them to sign something. That really, I found it very difficult, because it doesn't work, that kind of consent forms, and
Because that's what when you initially just directly go and tell them, I'm from this thing, they'll obviously become suspicious. What exactly is happening.
I think it's always good to take just more time, and then tell them that this is the purpose, and I think they'll be able to talk to you actually. Thank you.
One more question.
Okay.
I'm not judging anyone. But so you're a Christian. And you are researching in Unani, which is Islamic in a sense. And you have also seen Ayurveda. So how did you, going through all these places, how do you now see, like in North India these days, like if someone asks their name, it's usually considered about religion. So
I think it's very interesting. Yes, I have a Christian name, but so what happens is when you go to these places, the first identity is like, oh, you're a practitioner of a discipline, like okay, you're an anthropologist or everything. But of course, at some point of time, this will come. But I guess in my case, what happens is sometimes this exoticness of my name, I guess. But, it helps, I guess, these places, but but of course, it has other complications. They want to really know whether they can talk to you and everything. But that we can discuss later, I guess.
Can I just add to that point about the religious identity? This is something that came up when you gave the talk in New York. Your work with Unani, and also discussions we had with Andrew Amstutz.
Another history.
At the City University of New York. He's a scholar of Islamic India and Urdu language politics. And we kind of decided that Unani is probably best not seen as Islamic. There's nothing Islamic about it. There are Islamic medicines. There's Islamic humoralism. There's Quranic healing. But Unani, I remember, as I mentioned when I discussed the comparisons of classic Greek and Chinese medicine chapter earlier, Unani has the same origin as allopathy. And so it comes from the Greek and sort of circum-Mediterranean cultures. And Andrew Amstutz actually clarified that we maybe better think of it as part of the Persian rather than the Islamic world. So it probably came from Greece and Egypt to Persia. And then over probably hundreds of years. Moved from Persia to India. So it comes from this Mediterranean culture. Of course, now it's associated with Islam because of the Mughal Empire and all that, but there's nothing really necessarily Islamic in the logic of Unani medicine. It's sort of a secondary.
I think that's extremely important, because then if you look at, the historical debates, you see that how Unani is actually called as a Greco-medicine. Even in, historians in India, when they write about Indo-Greco medicine. So it's interesting then, to really look at Unani as a practice beyond Islam. Right? I mean, the various conversations that happened over a period of time. And Seema Alavi's book is very fascinating. I think it is called Faith and Healing. She talks about the history of Unani, specifically in the Indian context, to see that she calls it, of course, Indo-Islamic, because the practice that we have in this part of the world actually originated here in conversation with various medicine, including Ayurveda. So, one of her essays that came in Modern Asian Studies, Seema Alavi, I would really encourage you to read, where she really talks about the kind of conversation the Ayurvedic practitioners actually had with Unani and the reciprocity between these two. So that's where I think it is important to really look at most of these I think, the Ayurveda, when you study, I think Murphy was also talking, you'll find a lot of the Ayurvedic practitioners are Muslims and Christians. So, so how do we study these medical practices also beyond the identities that we very often associate with these medicines, like Islamic and Christian, Hindu, etc.?